Welcome to another deep dive. Today, things are going to get pretty intense as we explore the world of the Manosphere, all thanks to this hefty stack of articles and research you sent our way. You clearly want to understand this online network that's been making headlines and sparking serious debate.
It's a fascinating and complex world.
Yeah.
And you're right, it has been getting more attention lately.
So let's unpack this together. We're going to break down what the Manosphere actually days here, explore the core beliefs that fuel these online communities, and try to trace how it's evolved from fringe groups to something with a much wider reach.
And perhaps even more importantly, I will delve into WHY. These ideologies resonate with some men. What needs are they fulfilling? What anxieties are they tapping into?
Exactly. It's not enough to just describe what these groups believe. We need to understand the underlying forces that are driving this phenomenon. But first, we've got to lay the groundwork. What exactly are we talking about when we say manosphere?
Well, think of it like a constellation, not a single star. It's a network of interconnected online communities, each with its own distinct flavor. You've got groups like men's rights activists, or MRAs, who focus on perceived injustices against men in areas like family courts. Then you've got the incels, short for involuntary celibates, who harbor intense resentment toward women for their perceived lack of romantic success.
And let's not forget the MGTOWs, or men going their own way. They advocate for complete separation from women, believing that society is inherently biased against men.
Each group has its own unique set of beliefs and practices, but they all share a common thread: a deep opposition to feminism. They see feminism as the root cause of many societal problems, arguing that it has gone too far and now actively disadvantages men.
So this anti-feminist stance is really the glue that holds the whole manosphere together.
It's a defining characteristic, for sure. And this leads to another key pillar: the narrative of male victimhood. The manosphere portrays men as victims in a society they perceive as gynocentric, meaning female-centered.
There's an article here that quotes a popular manosphere forum, where a man says, "Men are the disposable sex. We're expected to work ourselves to death, fight wars, and then get demonized if we show any emotion." That feeling of being used and discarded seems to be pretty common in these spaces.
Exactly. They believe men are systematically oppressed by women and a society that favors female interests. They point to statistics about male suicide rates, homelessness, or workplace deaths as evidence that men are the ones who are truly disadvantaged. Now, those issues are absolutely real and serious, but the manosphere's interpretation often frames them as direct results of feminist agendas.
So it's not just about disagreeing with feminist principles. It's about feeling like men are actively being harmed by a society that's rigged against them. It's interesting, though, because they often advocate for a return to traditional masculinity as the solution.
Yes, this is where it gets really fascinating, because on the surface, it seems paradoxical. They're claiming to be victims, yet they're also promoting a vision of manhood that's all about strength, dominance, and control.
It's like they're saying, we're being oppressed, but we need to reclaim our rightful place as leaders and providers.
Exactly. And that's where the ideal of the alpha male comes in. He's the ultimate embodiment of traditional masculinity: assertive, successful, and irresistible to women.
But if they see themselves as victims, how do they reconcile that with this desire to be the alpha?
That's the key question. They believe that modern society, particularly feminism, has emasculated men, stripped them of their natural alpha qualities. So reclaiming those qualities becomes both a form of resistance and a path to power. They're not just trying to restore some lost golden age. They're trying to reclaim a dominant position in a world they see as increasingly hostile to traditional masculinity.
And it's not just about power in the abstract. For many in the manosphere, it's directly tied to sex and relationships.
Absolutely. We see this especially in communities like the pickup artists, or PUAs, who develop and share tactics for manipulating women into sexual encounters. They even use terms like gaming the system and view seduction as a competition.
There's an article here that analyzes a PUA forum where men are literally ranking women based on their perceived value in the dating market.
That's a perfect example of how this mindset dehumanizes women. They're not seen as individuals with their own agency and desires, but rather as targets to be conquered.
And for groups like the incels, who define themselves by their inability to find romantic partners, this resentment towards women can become incredibly toxic. There's a lot of talk in these forums about women being shallow, hypergamous, and only interested in high-value men.
It's a breeding ground for bitterness and rage. And unfortunately, this is where the red pill comes in.
It feels like we can't talk about the manosphere without talking about the red pill. It's everywhere in this research.
It's the gateway drug,
Mm.
so to speak. It's a term borrowed from the Matrix, where taking the red pill means choosing to see the harsh reality of the world.
So in the context of the manosphere, taking the red pill means waking up to their version of reality.
Exactly. It's about accepting their worldview. Feminism is the enemy, men are oppressed, and traditional masculinity is the only path to power and fulfillment.
And once you've taken the red pill, there's no going back.
According to them, no, you're either red-pilled and aware, or you're still living in blissful ignorance. And this ties into something we talked about earlier, the appeal of simple explanations.
Right. Life is complicated and relationships are messy, but the manosphere offers this very black and white view of the world.
It simplifies everything down to a single enemy, feminism.
Yeah.
And by accepting this worldview, they feel like they've finally unlocked the secrets to understanding how the world really works.
Which in turn can make them feel more powerful and in control, even if that control is often based on an illusion.
That's the danger of these simplified narratives. They can be very seductive, especially for men who are feeling lost, angry, or disillusioned.
And what's really disturbing is that the red pill isn't even the end of the rabbit hole. There's also the black pill.
Right, for some.
Mhm.
The red pill eventually leads to the black pill, which is essentially nihilism. They believe that they are doomed to fail in life, especially in romantic relationships, because of factors beyond their control, like their looks or their social status.
So it's like a more extreme, despairing version of the red pill ideology.
Exactly. And this is where the potential for violence becomes even greater. When you combine that sense of hopelessness with the intense misogyny that's already present, it can create a very volatile mix.
Well, this is already a lot to process. We've established that the manosphere is this network of interconnected communities united by their opposition to feminism and their belief in male victimhood. And within this ecosystem, the red pill acts as both a recruitment tool and a powerful symbol of belonging.
And we've only just scratched the surface. The manosphere is constantly evolving, adapting to new technologies and cultural trends. It's important to understand where it came from and how it's changed over time if we want to truly grasp its impact on society today. It's interesting to think about the historical roots of the manosphere. It didn't just spring up out of nowhere. Some of these articles trace it back to the men's liberation movement of the 1970s.
That's surprising. I always thought of the men's liberation movement as being somewhat aligned with feminism, at least in its early stages.
It's true that there was some overlap, especially in terms of challenging traditional gender roles. But even from the beginning, there were tensions and disagreements within the movement.
So some men felt like feminism was going too far, encroaching on their territory.
Exactly. They felt like their voices weren't being heard, that men's issues were being ignored or even ridiculed. And these feelings of resentment and alienation really laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the manosphere.
It's like a splinter group that broke away from the main movement and took a much darker turn.
That's a good analogy. And of course, the rise of the internet played a huge role in this evolution.
It gave them a platform to connect with like-minded individuals, to build communities, and to amplify their message in ways that were never possible before.
Exactly. The internet became a breeding ground for these ideologies, allowing them to spread and evolve outside of the mainstream media and academia.
And without that scrutiny, things could get pretty extreme. One article here mentions a study that tracked the language used in manosphere forums over time. It found a noticeable shift towards more aggressive and hateful rhetoric, especially in the last decade or so.
That's a worrying trend. And it seems like there's been a migration of users towards more extreme communities like the incels and MTTOWs. They're attracting those who are most disillusioned and angry, those who feel like they have nothing left to lose.
It's like the manosphere itself has become more radicalized. It's no longer just about men's rights or even about challenging feminism. It's become this breeding ground for misogyny, conspiracy theories, and even violence.
Right. And that's why it's so important to understand this historical trajectory. It helps us see how these seemingly disparate groups and ideologies are actually interconnected and how they've built upon each other over time.
It's like a river that starts as a small stream but gains momentum as it picks up more tributaries along the way.
Yeah.
And eventually, it can become a raging torrent.
Exactly. And another tributary that's been feeding into this river is the rise of the alt-right and white nationalism.
Several of these articles highlight the growing overlap between the manosphere and these far-right movements.
They share a common enemy in feminism and multiculturalism. They see themselves as defenders of Western civilization. which they believe is under attack by these forces.
So it's not just about gender anymore. It's become part of this larger, more sinister ideology that's rooted in white supremacy and xenophobia.
And this is where the real danger lies. Because when you combine the misogyny of the manosphere with the racism and xenophobia of the far right, you create a truly toxic and dangerous brew.
It's scary to think how these ideologies are feeding off each other and reinforcing each other's worst impulses.
And the internet provides the perfect ecosystem for this kind of cross-pollination. These ideas can spread rapidly, mutate, and reach a global audience in a matter of hours.
It makes you wonder, how do we even begin to address something so pervasive and multifaceted?
Well, one place to start is by understanding the appeal of these ideologies. What draws men into these communities in the first place?
We've already touched on some of the reasons: the sense of victimhood, the allure of simple explanations, the desire for power and control. But I think there's more to it than that.
Absolutely. I think a big part of it is the search for belonging for many men, especially those who are struggling with traditional notions of masculinity. The manosphere offers a sense of community and validation that they might not be finding elsewhere.
It's like finding your tribe, a group of people who understand your struggles and make you feel like you're not alone.
Exactly. And in a world that can feel increasingly isolating and confusing, that sense of belonging can be incredibly powerful.
One article here describes these online forums as digital man caves, where men can escape from the pressures and expectations of the outside world.
And within those spaces, they can vent their frustrations, share their grievances, and receive support from others who are going through similar experiences.
But it's not just about finding a place to vent. It's also about finding a sense of purpose.
Right. The manosphere often presents itself as a movement, a fight against injustice. It gives men a cause to rally behind, a reason to feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves.
It's almost like a call to arms, a rallying cry for men to reclaim their lost masculinity and fight back against the forces that are supposedly oppressing them.
And that can be a very seductive message, especially for men who are feeling disillusioned or powerless in their own lives.
It gives them a sense of agency, a way to channel their anger and frustration into something that feels meaningful and productive.
But the problem is, that sense of purpose is often built on a foundation of hate and resentment. It's about tearing others down rather than building something positive and constructive.
And it can have very real consequences in the offline world.
Absolutely. We've seen this with the rise of incel violence, for example. When those feelings of anger and resentment fester, they can lead to acts of real-world harm.
It's like those digital man caves are becoming incubators for extremism, breeding grounds for violence and hate.
And that's why it's so crucial to understand the psychology behind these movements, to see how they exploit men's vulnerabilities and anxieties.
Because if we can understand the root causes, we can start to develop more effective strategies for prevention and intervention.
Exactly. We need to offer men healthier alternatives, ways to find belonging and purpose without resorting to toxic masculinity and misogyny.
We need to show them that there's another way to be a man, a way that's based on empathy, respect, and connection.
But we also need to acknowledge the very real challenges that men are facing in today's world. Challenges like changing gender roles, economic uncertainty, and a crisis of identity.
Because if we ignore those challenges, we risk further alienating men and driving them towards these extremist ideologies.
It's about finding a balance, addressing men's legitimate concerns while also challenging the harmful beliefs and behaviors that are at the heart of the manosphere.
It's a complex issue,
Yeah.
but it's one we need to confront head-on if we want to create a more just and equitable society for everyone.
And speaking of complexities, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, the black manosphere.
Right. This is another layer to this whole phenomenon that deserves our attention.
It's not enough to just talk about the manosphere as if it's a monolithic entity composed entirely of white men. We need to acknowledge the diversity within these online spaces.
And the Black Manosphere is a prime example of that. It takes those core manosphere ideologies, anti-feminism, male victimhood, traditional masculinity, and applies them to the specific experiences of Black men.
And they're not just copying and pasting those ideas. They're adapting them, reframing them through the lens of race and racism.
There's an article here that analyzes the rhetoric of a popular Black Manosphere influencer. He talks a lot about the emasculating effects of racism, how Black men have been systematically stripped of their power and their manhood.
And this sense of emasculation is often linked to the perceived behavior of Black women.
Right. There's this idea that Black women are too independent, too
Mhm.
strong, and not supportive enough of Black men.
It's a dangerous narrative that pits Black men and women against each other, undermining Black solidarity and perpetuating harmful stereotypes.
It's like they're taking the general Manosphere playbook and adding another layer of complexity, another axis of oppression to their worldview.
Exactly. And this has sparked a lot of debate within the Black community. Some see the Black manosphere as a necessary space for Black men to address their unique challenges, while others criticize it for promoting misogynoir and reinforcing harmful gender dynamics.
It's a really nuanced and challenging conversation, and honestly, I'm not sure there's an easy answer.
I agree. But I think it's important to have that conversation, to engage with these ideas critically, and to listen to the diverse perspectives within the Black community.
We need to understand the historical and social context that's shaping these ideologies. And we need to find ways to address the underlying issues of racism, sexism, and inequality that are fueling this anger and resentment.
It's a reminder that the manosphere is not a monolithic entity. It's diverse, it's evolving, and it's constantly finding new ways to adapt and spread its message.
And understanding those nuances is crucial if we want to truly grapple with this phenomenon and its impact on society. We spent a lot of time mapping out the manosphere, its origins, and even its psychology, but I think it's time we address the elephant in the room. What is the real world impact of all of this? We're talking about real people, real lives being affected.
You're absolutely right. The manosphere might primarily exist online, but its influence spills over into the real world in some pretty disturbing ways.
We've already touched on the violence that can stem from these communities, especially within the incel movement. There have been several high-profile attacks linked to incels in recent years, driven by this toxic mix of misogyny and despair.
And those tragic events aren't isolated incidents. They're a stark reminder that words have power, and the hateful rhetoric that's pervasive in these online spaces can have real-world consequences.
It's chilling to think that someone could go from posting angry rants in an online forum to committing acts of violence.
The internet can create a dangerous echo chamber where these extreme views are constantly reinforced and amplified. And for someone who's already vulnerable or isolated, that can be a recipe for disaster.
But even beyond those extreme cases, there's a broader cultural impact to consider. It feels like the language and attitudes of the manosphere are seeping into mainstream discourse, shaping how people talk about gender and relationships.
You're picking up on something really important. We're seeing a rise in casual misogyny and sexism, both online and offline. It's becoming increasingly acceptable to make derogatory comments about women, to dismiss feminist concerns, and to promote these narrow and harmful views of masculinity.
Like it's somehow become cool to be anti-feminist.
Exactly. And this normalization of these attitudes has a corrosive effect on society as a whole. It creates a climate of hostility and disrespect where women feel unsafe, unheard, and marginalized.
And that can have a ripple effect in so many areas of life, from the workplace to personal relationships.
Absolutely. It can impact everything from hiring decisions to how women are treated in social settings. It creates a power imbalance that makes it even harder to address real issues of gender inequality.
It's like we're taking a step backward instead of forward.
And it's important to remember that this isn't just a women's issue. The manosphere also harms men by trapping them in these rigid and outdated definitions of masculinity.
So it's not just about women being hurt by this ideology, it's also about men being limited by it. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, think about the pressure these ideologies place on men. They're constantly being told that they need to be strong, stoic, dominant, and successful. They're taught to suppress their emotions, to see vulnerability as weakness, and to view relationships as a power struggle.
It's like they're being forced to conform to this very narrow and unrealistic ideal of manhood.
Exactly. And that could have a devastating impact on their mental health
Mm.
and their ability to form healthy relationships. They end up feeling isolated,
Mm.
angry, and resentful, which ironically
Yeah.
are the very feelings that the manosphere exploits to recruit new members.
It's a vicious cycle.
And it's a cycle that we need to break. We need to start challenging these harmful ideologies and creating spaces where men can explore their emotions,
Yeah.
connect with others in authentic ways, and redefine masculinity in a way that's healthy and empowering.
So we've established that the manosphere is having a real impact on society, both in terms of tangible harms like violence and in more subtle ways, like shifting attitudes and norms. But the big question is, what do we do about it? Where do we even begin to address something so complex and deeply rooted?
There's no easy answer, and it's going to require a multifaceted approach. But I think a good place to start is with education.
We need to be having these conversations in schools, in families, and in communities. We need to teach young people about healthy masculinity, respectful relationships, and the dangers of online extremism.
Exactly. We need to equip them with the critical thinking skills to recognize these harmful ideologies and to resist the allure of simple explanations and scapegoating.
And we can't just focus on young people. We need to reach out to those who are already caught up in the manosphere to offer them support and alternative perspectives.
There are organizations and individuals doing amazing work in this area, helping men disengage from these communities and find healthier ways to address their challenges. We need to support these efforts and make sure these resources are widely available.
Social media platforms also have a huge role to play. They need to take responsibility for the content that's being shared on their platforms and do more to prevent the spread of hate speech and misinformation.
We need stronger content moderation policies, better algorithms for detecting and removing harmful content, and more transparency from these companies about how they're addressing these issues.
But it's not just about censorship, it's also about creating counter-narratives,
Yeah.
about amplifying the voices of those who are challenging these ideologies and promoting a more inclusive and equitable vision of society.
We need to flood the internet with positive and empowering messages about masculinity, relationships, and equality. We need to show men that there is another way, a way that doesn't rely on anger, resentment, and domination.
It's about changing the cultural conversation, about shifting the narrative from one of fear and division to one of empathy and understanding.
And that's something we can all contribute to. We can start by having these conversations with our friends and family, by challenging sexist jokes and stereotypes, and by supporting organizations and individuals who are working to promote gender equality.
It's about recognizing that this is a societal problem that requires a societal solution. We all have a role to play in creating a world where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued.
It's a long and challenging road ahead, but I believe that change is possible. We've seen progress before, and we can continue to make progress if we work together and refuse to accept the status quo.
Well said. This deep dive into the manosphere has been eye-opening, to say the least. It's exposed a dark underbelly of the internet, but it's also given us a better understanding of the forces at play and the steps we can take to counter these harmful ideologies.
It's important to remember that this isn't just an abstract academic exercise. This is about real people's lives. It's about creating a world where everyone can thrive, regardless of their gender.
We hope that this deep dive has given you the knowledge and the motivation to be a part of that change. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better world.